January 17, 1940. The frost has tightened its grip over Buckinghamshire. Inside a dim room at Bletchley Park, typewriter keys chatter like nervous teeth. A low hum from the bomb machine fills the air, a rhythmic mechanical heartbeat in the dark. Cigarette smoke drifts between the flicker of lamps, and the scent of damp wool and cold metal lingers. A young cryptanalyst, no older than 23, leans forward, tracing a line of letters on a sheet torn from the Enigma intercept log. The sequence repeats. Once, twice, again, something that should never repeat. His pulse steadies. He calls for a supervisor. They both stare at the sequence in silence, realizing what it might mean. Somewhere in occupied Europe, a German radio operator has made a small, human mistake. Something routine, something careless. But in this room, that single oversight feels like the crack of thunder before a storm. It is the smallest of errors. Yet it will open the largest secret of the war. This is where the greatest intelligence triumph of the 20th century begins. To understand how that single German mistake reshaped the course of World War II, we must return to the coded heartbeat of the conflict itself, the Enigma machine. By 1939, Germany had turned encryption into an art form. Every message, every order, every whisper between its armies pulsed through a device that was both mechanical and mathematical. To its users, Enigma was invincible, a symphony of rotors, electrical pathways, and daily changing settings that could turn a simple word into a fortress of confusion. With 3 rotors, each carrying 26 positions, and a plug board adding another layer of chaos, the total number of possible combinations reached into the trillions. To any ordinary analyst, it was impenetrable. But like all machines made by humans, it carried within it the quiet flaw of human habit. That flaw began not in Britain, but in Poland. In 1932, as Europe balanced uneasily between 2 wars, 3 mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski, at the Polish Cipher Bureau in Warsaw began dissecting Enigma with nothing but intercepted messages and relentless logic. They did not guess or hope, they calculated. Using permutation theory and limited intelligence from a French source within the German cipher network, they reconstructed the internal wiring of Enigma's rotors. By 1938, they had built mechanical aids known as bombas, the first machines to test rotor settings automatically. Yet even their genius could not stop what was coming. As Germany prepared for war, it added more rotors, increased plugboard complexity, and tightened procedures. The Poles knew that once the invasion began, their window would close. In July 1939, just weeks before the first shots of the war, they invited British and French representatives to a secret meeting in Pyry, outside Warsaw. There, in a small forest clearing, they revealed everything: their mathematical techniques, their replica Enigma machines, and the insight that the system's weakness lay not in its design, but in its users. They handed over their work as a final act of defiance, knowing they might soon be overrun. When Poland fell in September, the knowledge they had passed on became one of the few lights in a rapidly darkening world. Britain took that light to a quiet estate in Buckinghamshire, Bletchley Park. By late 1939, a small team of linguists, chess champions, mathematicians, and engineers gathered there under the government code and cipher school. The site was unassuming, an eccentric mansion surrounded by huts and mud. Yet within those wooden walls, the future of the war would be shaped. Among them was a shy mathematician from Cambridge, Alan Turing, whose mind worked with the precision of a machine and the intuition of an artist. His goal was clear: to turn the Polish methods into something faster, stronger, and capable of keeping pace with the enemy's changing keys. But the challenge was staggering. Every morning at midnight Berlin time, every German operator reset the Enigma's configuration. New rotor orders, new plugboard cables, new ground settings. Each message carried an indicator, a short, encrypted clue meant to tell the receiver which rotor positions to start from. In theory, this system was flawless. In practice, it depended on human discipline. Operators were supposed to choose random message keys. Instead, they used habits, their girlfriend's initials, Simple words like A or SSS, or even repeated yesterday's key for convenience. Some sent identical messages with different settings to confirm transmission quality. Others used standard openings such as Wetterbericht, the weather report. Every slip of routine became a fingerprint, and those fingerprints were everywhere. German pride in Enigma's invincibility bred complacency. Radio operators, tired or overconfident, ignored instructions. The German High Command, unaware of the potential consequences, never enforced complete randomness. The system that was meant to guarantee secrecy became, in British eyes, a pattern generator. At first, Bletchley's work was slow, almost desperate. Each message took weeks to untangle. But the foundation laid by the Poles, their mathematical blueprints and replicas, provided a foothold. The Allies now knew Enigma could be beaten. The question was how fast and how often before the war swallowed Europe whole. The frost of January 1940 had not yet melted when the first spark of hope arrived. Somewhere in Germany's vast network, a careless operator had sent a message that repeated part of his indicator sequence, the same mistake seen by that young analyst at Bletchley Park. For the first time, they saw a crack in the machine's armor, a glimpse of the human behind the code. It was the beginning of a pattern, one they would learn to exploit, one that would grow into a weapon stronger than any bomb. Bletchley Park in 1940 was not yet the humming hive of wartime legend. It was a cluster of drafty wooden huts, their windows sealed against the cold with thick blackout curtains. Mud clung to every boot. Inside, typewriters clicked without rest, and radios hissed with intercepted static from across occupied Europe. Yet beneath the exhaustion and secrecy, something extraordinary was taking shape. The world's first organized intelligence factory, a place where human patience and mechanical precision worked together to unlock the war's deepest secret. The British government had quietly gathered some of the sharpest minds of the age. Linguists, mathematicians, crossword champions, even poets. Some were professors from Cambridge and Oxford. Others were young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, trained in precision and discipline. They lived in total secrecy, unable to tell family or friends what they did. The orders were clear. Everything inside Bletchley stayed inside Bletchley. What began as a handful of analysts under Commander Alistair Denniston grew into thousands of people working around the clock. Among them, Alan Turing stood out, not for his rank or authority, but for his strange, focused mind. In the dim light of Hut 8, he and his colleague Gordon Welchman wrestled with the Enigma's logic. They were not breaking a single code. They were building a system capable of breaking any code. Turing's insight was elegant and ruthless. Machines must fight machines. He envisioned a device that could test millions of Enigma settings faster than any human. From this idea emerged the bomb, an electromechanical monster of whirring drums and wires, each simulating Enigma's internal paths. But even the bomb needed a starting point. It could only work if the analysts had a clue, a small piece of guessed plaintext hidden somewhere in the message, known as a crib. The Germans, in their discipline and predictability, unknowingly provided those clues every day. Common phrases like Wetter Vorher Sage, weather forecast, or ANX, for Anschluss, meaning connection, appeared often enough to serve as anchors. Turing's team learned to recognize patterns, comparing intercepted traffic across multiple stations to locate repetition. Slowly, they began to reconstruct daily keys. Yet the path was not smooth. By early 1940, German operators began tightening some procedures, and the growing volume of encrypted traffic threatened to drown Bletchley's limited capacity. Successes were fragile, often lost when the enemy introduced new rotors or settings. The cryptanalysts fought against time, exhaustion, and mathematics itself. In the depths of Hut 6, another breakthrough came from John Herrivel, a young mathematician from Cambridge. His idea, later called the Herrivel tip, was simple but brilliant. German operators, cold and rushed at the start of their shifts, often failed to randomize their rotor settings properly. Instead, they selected nearby positions out of convenience. This tiny human laziness created predictable clusters in the indicators. Herrivel's insight gave the analysts a new way to narrow the search, a psychological attack on mechanical encryption. Still, there were moments of despair. Messages stacked high in baskets, untouched, while outside, Europe burned. Norway, France, the Low Countries, each fell faster than the analysts could decrypt their orders. The Luftwaffe's communications flooded the airwaves, and the Royal Navy demanded intelligence faster than it could be produced. The codebreakers knew that every minute of delay might cost lives at sea or on the battlefield. The work grew heavier, the nights longer. But each small success proved something greater, that the Enigma, for all its complexity, was not invincible. By mid-1940, Welchman added his own refinement, the diagonal board, an innovation that multiplied the bomb's efficiency. With it, settings that once took days could be reduced to hours. The speed of decryption increased, and confidence spread through the huts. What had begun as fragile mathematical hope was now becoming a systematic process. Then came the capture of code materials at sea, fragments of Enigma documents, weather keys, and operating manuals, wrested from German vessels by the Royal Navy. Each recovery tightened the noose around the German cipher network. The cooperation between the Navy and Bletchley Park forged a feedback loop of intelligence. Decrypts guided ships, ships captured new keys, and new keys fed fresh decrypts. The rhythm of discovery began to accelerate. Still, the analysts never forgot the source of their advantage. Beneath the machinery, the logic and the secrecy lay one undeniable truth. Enigma's weakness was not in its engineering. It was in its users. One operator's mistake had exposed a pattern, and that pattern had opened a world. That world, however, was only beginning to reveal its depth. The coming months would transform scattered breakthroughs into the most powerful secret weapon of the war, a weapon hidden not in steel but in silence. Inside the world of code-breaking, there were no front lines, no medals, no battlefield smoke, only minds waging silent war. Yet within this hidden conflict, many angles converged. Human, tactical, and technological. Each revealed a different face of what it meant to fight a war not with bullets, but with information. The first angle was deeply human. The people of Bletchley Park were a mosaic of intellect and endurance. They were young women fresh from university, mathematicians pulled from classrooms, chess champions who could read patterns like poetry. Many had never seen a battlefield, yet they carried the weight of thousands of lives with every decision. They worked behind locked doors, bound by secrecy so complete that even those sharing a hut rarely knew what the others were doing. A single intercepted message could take days to unravel. Hours of tension where hope lived and died between letters on a page. Mistakes were not just errors. They were losses measured in ships sunk and soldiers ambushed. But in the midst of exhaustion, the workers found quiet strength. Some knitted or smoked through the long nights. Others whispered fragments of decoded phrases that made the war feel suddenly real. Behind every victory lay human frailty. Trembling hands, sleepless eyes, and the unspoken knowledge that they would never be publicly thanked for what they had done. The second angle was tactical. Code-breaking meant little without strategy. The intelligence drawn from Enigma, soon known by the codename Ultra, had to be used carefully, selectively. If the Germans ever suspected their system was compromised, they would change it instantly, closing the window that Bletchley had pried open. So the British faced a paradox. To use the information, they had to act as though they didn't have it. Convoys were rerouted subtly, patrols redirected under plausible excuses, and air raids launched where coincidence could mask intent. It was an elaborate game of deception, an intelligence ballet choreographed with deadly precision. Analysts at Bletchley would send their decrypts to the Admiralty or Air Ministry through intermediaries who disguised the source. Reports were rewritten, sometimes deliberately diluted, to protect the truth. The result was a delicate equilibrium, a secret advantage that could never be revealed, even to those risking their lives in combat. Every use of ultra-intelligence was a gamble. How much could be shown before the enemy noticed a pattern? Commanders learned to act on information only when it seemed naturally obtained, turning intuition and luck into tools of security. In this way, The tactical power of Bletchley Park extended far beyond mathematics. It became a philosophy of invisible warfare. The third angle was technological, the steady transformation from manual deciphering to mechanical speed. At the beginning of the war, code-breaking was still largely human labor, pen, paper, and logic. But the scale of intercepted traffic made this impossible to sustain. Alan Turing's bomb machines changed that forever. They were the physical embodiment of logic, rows of rotating drums wired to simulate Enigma's rotors, racing through combinations at a rate no human could match. Each bomb could test up to 10,000 settings per minute, reducing days of work to hours. But even these machines needed constant calibration, guided by human insight. Engineers tuned them, operators ran them in shifts, and when a possible match appeared, a faint glimmer of sense amid nonsense, analysts pounced. This was not automation. It was symbiosis. The bombs extended the reach of human reasoning, but they could not replace it. The mind remained the final instrument of war. In this technological battle, time was the true enemy. Each morning at midnight, the Germans changed their settings. Every intercept not solved within a day became useless. The codebreakers lived by the clock, racing against it with unrelenting pressure. The sound of the bomb, a deep mechanical rhythm, became the pulse of the operation. In its turning drums, one could almost hear the heartbeat of the war itself. The intersection of these three angles, human endurance, tactical restraint, and technological innovation, created a new kind of warfare. It was fought not in the open, but in whispers and wires, in logic and secrecy. Each element depended on the others. The machines were powerless without the analyst's intuition. The decrypts were meaningless without careful strategy. And the people, for all their brilliance, needed the machines to give their thoughts speed. Together they formed an organism, Bletchley Park, as a living intelligence engine, breathing through cables and code, sustained by quiet faith in the unseen impact of their work. By 1941, this organism had begun to grow stronger. The breakthroughs were becoming consistent, the bombs more efficient, and the Germans more careless in their habits. But as the British peeled back the layers of Enigma, they began to realize that their own understanding of the enemy's behavior, the psychology behind those mistakes, might be as important as any mathematical breakthrough. The story of how those German errors persisted, how human shortcuts survived inside a machine built for perfection, forms the next angle of this secret war. The fourth angle lay not in Britain's huts, but in the minds of the enemy, the German operators who, without ever knowing it, gave away their own secrets. Enigma was supposed to be unbreakable, and in theory it was. But no machine, however perfect, could survive human routine. Radio operators across the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine followed strict encryption procedures. Yet war is chaos, and humans crave order. They made their work easier by cutting corners, reusing message keys, typing predictable phrases, or forgetting to reset their rotors properly after each transmission. Some even used the same introductions or sign-offs day after day. These habits, called sillies by the British, became the cracks in an iron wall. There were operators who used QWE or ABC as their keys. Others typed the initials of their wives or girlfriends. And though the German High Command regularly issued warnings, discipline at the lowest levels faltered. In the noise of radio warfare, small mistakes echoed loudly. Each one handed Bletchley Park another thread to pull. The arrogance of perfection, the belief that Enigma could not fail, became its most fatal flaw. The fifth angle was one of leadership, how men at the top decided what to do with the impossible gift that Ultra provided. Winston Churchill, briefed on the operation's growing success, grasped its significance immediately. "It is thanks to the secret weapon of Bletchley Park," he later wrote, "that we won the war." But even in 1940, he understood that knowledge could be more dangerous than ignorance if mishandled. Only a handful of generals and admirals were allowed to see the decrypted material, and even they were told as little as possible about its source. Messages derived from Ultra were rewritten in vague summaries, distributed under a new system called the Special Liaison Units. These units ensured that information reached the front lines without betraying where it came from. Churchill himself referred to Bletchley's work as his golden goose, never to be killed by exposure or carelessness. The secrecy was absolute. Even within the government, some doubted whether such an operation truly existed. This leadership discipline kept the advantage alive, even as the temptation to exploit it more boldly grew stronger. But leadership also required moral restraint. There were times when the codebreakers uncovered imminent attacks, convoys destined for ambush, raids about to begin, and the choice had to be made. Act on the knowledge and risk revealing ultra, or let lives be lost to preserve the secret. These were decisions no soldier on a battlefield could ever imagine. In the quiet corridors of Bletchley, victory demanded silence, even sacrifice. The few who knew the truth bore the weight of that silence for the rest of their lives. The sixth angle came from the sea, from the deadly chess game fought across the Atlantic. If the land-based Enigma networks were difficult, the naval version was a monster. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, used extra rotors and tighter discipline, making its Enigma traffic far harder to crack. Yet it was here, amid the struggle of convoys and U-boats, that Bletchley Park's work reached its most decisive edge. Every Allied ship crossing the Atlantic carried not just supplies, but the fragile thread of Britain's survival. The U-boats hunted them relentlessly, guided by Enigma-coded orders that shifted wolf pack positions across the ocean. For months, Bletchley could do nothing but listen, until fortune intervened. In May 1941, the British destroyer Bulldog and the corvette Obriettia captured the German submarine U-110 after it was crippled by depth charges. Inside the sub, Royal Navy sailors recovered codebooks, operating instructions, and even an intact Enigma machine. For the men at Bletchley Park, it was as if the ocean itself had handed them the key to its secrets. Combined with their growing ability to exploit operator mistakes, the captured materials unlocked entire streams of naval traffic. Slowly, they began to reroute convoys safely through the Atlantic, steering them away from lurking U-boats without arousing German suspicion. Each successful voyage saved thousands of tons of vital cargo, food, fuel, ammunition, that kept Britain alive. The naval war also illustrated the fragile balance between luck and method. While Bletchley's bombs tore through endless rotor combinations, much of their progress depended on daring actions at sea, seizing enemy vessels, boarding weather ships, or intercepting signals under fire. Each operation carried the risk of death, but also the promise of information that could change the course of the war. The partnership between sailors and codebreakers blurred the line between battlefield heroism and quiet brilliance. Together, these angles revealed a single truth. The war of information was fought on every level of human existence, in thought, in leadership, in error, and in fear. The Germans built their empire of encryption on the assumption that men could behave like machines. The British built their counterattack on the understanding that men never do, and as 1941 unfolded, that understanding would lead to the war's most pivotal turning point, when one side's overconfidence and another's persistence collided, and the secret of Ultra became a weapon powerful enough to shift the balance of global conflict. By the spring of 1941, the rhythm of Bletchley Park had settled into something almost mechanical, a 24-hour pulse of intercepted messages, rotating bombs, and exhausted minds straining for coherence in chaos. The huts smelled of damp paper and cold tea. Operators worked by lamplight, their eyes fixed on columns of meaningless letters. But beneath the monotony, the tension was electric. Somewhere inside those strings of code, entire battles were being written in advance. Every solved message could mean the difference between disaster and survival. It was in this crucible of fatigue and obsession that the balance began to shift. The Germans, unaware that their system was bleeding secrets, tightened their grip on Europe. U-boats prowled the Atlantic with ruthless efficiency. The Luftwaffe prepared for new offensives. The Wehrmacht drove deep into the Balkans and North Africa. To the outside world, the Axis looked unstoppable. But inside Bletchley Park, A quiet revolution was taking place, a collision of intellect, luck, and human error that would tip the scales of war. The decisive moment began with a convergence of small victories. The Polish foundations had given the British a blueprint. The Harrival tip had narrowed the search space. Welchman's diagonal board had accelerated the bombs. And the capture of U-110's Enigma and codebooks had provided a critical snapshot of German naval operations. Each success alone was valuable. Together, they became unstoppable. For the first time, Bletchley Park could read enemy traffic fast enough for it to matter. Messages that once took weeks to solve were now being decrypted within a day, sometimes within hours. The fog of war was beginning to thin. One of the first clear tests came in the Atlantic. Convoy after convoy had been ambushed by German wolf packs guided by Enigma-coded signals. British merchant losses reached catastrophic levels. But by June 1941, decrypts of U-boat messages began to flow steadily from Hut 8. Analysts could now see where the submarines planned to assemble, where they would strike, and even when they would refuel. The intelligence was delicate. It could not be acted upon too obviously, but it was enough to begin saving ships. Convoys were redirected through gaps in the enemy's net, slipping past unseen dangers. To the sailors, it seemed as though luck had finally turned. To the few who knew the truth, it was not luck at all, but the beginning of ultra, the code name chosen to signify information beyond top secret. Only a handful of men in Britain even knew it existed. Every decrypted message was stamped with the word in red ink before being locked inside a steel cabinet. Copies were hand-delivered by special liaison officers to a select list of recipients: Churchill, the chiefs of staff, and certain field commanders. Even those reading it were forbidden to ask how it had been obtained. To the military world, it appeared as if British intuition had suddenly become uncanny. Commanders guessed enemy movements with impossible accuracy. The Navy appeared to sense U-boats before they struck. RAF squadrons intercepted bombers as though reading their minds. The Germans never suspected that their own machines had turned traitor. In North Africa, this invisible weapon began to shape the Desert War. When Rommel, the Desert Fox, launched his offensives across Libya and Egypt, Bletchley's decrypts revealed the structure of his supply lines. Every shipment of fuel, every movement of tanks passed through Enigma-coded radio reports, and Bletchley was listening. The British learned to strike at Rommel's lifelines, destroying convoys before they reached the front. To the German general, the defeats seemed to come from nowhere. He complained bitterly about logistics, suspecting spies, but never imagining that his own radio operators had betrayed him. In truth, no spy could have provided what Ultra did, a real-time window into the heart of his command. Back in Britain, Alan Turing continued refining his machines. The bombs multiplied across the countryside, installed in secret facilities to handle the deluge of intercepts. Each machine hummed through the night, consuming miles of paper tape, its results feeding into the ever-growing intelligence network. What had begun as a handful of mathematicians had become a machine-driven intelligence empire. By late 1941, Bletchley was producing thousands of decrypts each month. It was no longer a desperate experiment. It was the beating heart of Allied strategy. But even as the breakthroughs mounted, the danger of exposure grew. The Germans remained confident in Enigma's perfection. Still, the risk was constant that a sudden coincidence, a convoy rerouted too precisely, an attack timed too accurately, might alert them. Every use of ultra-intelligence was a balancing act between necessity and secrecy. Commanders were instructed to act as though their knowledge came from reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, or sheer intuition. The illusion of randomness became a shield around the truth. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The flood of new radio traffic stretched Bletchley Park to its limits, but it also provided unprecedented insight into the scale of Hitler's ambitions. Through the intercepted orders and field reports, the British could watch the largest land invasion in history unfold in near real time. It was information beyond any previous scope, and it proved that Ultra was no longer just a tactical tool, but a strategic weapon. The mistake that had begun as a few careless repetitions by German operators had grown into a force that now guided Allied hands across continents. But the war was far from over. Even as Bletchley Park reached new heights, a darker challenge was looming. The return of the naval Enigma, hardened with new rotors and more disciplined procedures, threatening to close the door that had taken years to open. And so, just as the Allies began to glimpse mastery, the Germans prepared to seal their secrets once again. The year 1942 began with both triumph and uncertainty. Bletchley Park had reached an unprecedented rhythm. Messages flowed in from intercept stations across Britain and beyond, carried by dispatch riders through fog and blackout to the huts. The bombs roared, decoding signals that guided ships and saved convoys. Yet the mood inside the park was tense. The Germans had begun upgrading their systems. The Kriegsmarine introduced a new four-rotor Enigma machine, nicknamed Shark. Its additional complexity multiplied the possible combinations to near infinity. Overnight, the stream of decrypts that had kept the Atlantic lifeline alive fell silent. The ocean went dark again. For the British, it was as though the enemy had vanished beneath the waves. Convoy routes once guided by intelligence became blind. U-boats resumed their deadly hunts, and losses mounted. It was a return to the helplessness of the early war. The men and women of Hut 8 faced the same exhaustion, the same gnawing despair, but now under the weight of knowing what was at stake. They had seen the enemy's mind and lost it again, and they refused to accept defeat. The effort to reclaim the naval Enigma became the most intense phase of Bletchley's war. Turing, Welchman, and their teams attacked the new cipher with everything they had: mathematics, logic, and relentless trial. But progress was painfully slow. What finally tipped the balance once more was not a grand invention, but courage at sea. In October 1942, HMS Petard captured WWII in the Mediterranean after a brutal chase. As the submarine began to sink, a handful of Royal Navy sailors dove into the flooded wreck, retrieving codebooks from the rising water. Two of them, Tony Fasson and Colin Grazier, drowned during the recovery. But their sacrifice delivered the materials Bletchley needed. When the books arrived in Hut 8, still wet with seawater, the cryptanalysts fell silent. They knew what it meant. Within weeks, the Shark cipher began to unravel. The decrypts returned, and with them came control of the Atlantic once again. The Allies could now see the shifting formations of wolf packs, the schedules of refueling tankers, and the patrol grids that spanned the ocean. Convoys were rerouted safely, air patrols sent to the right coordinates, and U-boat ambushes were evaded. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic began to turn. It was not an instant victory. Losses continued, but the balance had shifted irreversibly. Every decoded message was a small act of vengeance for the sailors lost before. The silence of the sea was now filled with knowledge, and knowledge became power. Meanwhile, ultra-intelligence extended far beyond the Atlantic. In North Africa, Bletchley's decrypts guided the 8th Army's counterattacks against Rommel. In the skies, it directed RAF operations with surgical precision. The Codebreakers even began reading parts of the German High Command's communications, gaining glimpses into Hitler's strategic intentions. The British military establishment, once skeptical, now depended on Bletchley's reports as if they were radar readings. Ultra was becoming the nervous system of Allied command. Yet for all its success, the work remained invisible. The analysts who read enemy secrets were forbidden to speak of them, even to the commanders whose orders they shaped. The more decisive the intelligence became, the deeper the secrecy grew. Churchill called the Bletchley staff the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. The metaphor was perfect. They worked in silence, their achievements sealed beneath the weight of the Official Secrets Act. When victory came, they would fade quietly into ordinary lives, their war stories untold. in the grand view of history. The climax of Bletchley Park was not marked by explosions or banners, but by realization that the greatest weapon of the war was not a bomb or a tank, but the ability to know. Ultra turned war from a contest of force into a contest of information. Battles that seemed evenly matched were tilted before they began. The enemy's strength was undermined by its own voice, echoing in Allied ears. By late 1943, Ultra had become the foundation of Allied strategy. In the Mediterranean, it aided the planning of Operation Torch and the invasion of Sicily. In Russia, it provided insight into German movements on the Eastern Front. And in Britain, it began feeding into the vast deception efforts that would prepare the way for D-Day, operations designed to manipulate the same psychological weaknesses that had doomed Enigma from the start. The mistake that had begun with one careless operator now echoed through every corner of the war. It was no longer just a matter of breaking messages. It had become the art of controlling perception itself, shaping what the enemy believed to be true. Through Ultra, the Allies were not merely reading the war. They were quietly writing it, but with such power came unbearable weight. Every intercepted order, every decrypted signal carried moral consequences. The analysts knew that each choice, to act or not to act, determined lives. Sometimes they watched disaster unfold because protecting the secret mattered more than saving a single ship. This quiet burden, invisible to the world, was the true price of Ultra. By the time the Allies stood on the edge of victory, Bletchley Park had evolved from an improvised code-breaking station into the most sophisticated intelligence network on Earth. What began as an accident of human error had transformed into a revolution in warfare, one that would shape military intelligence for generations. The war was far from over, but the outcome was already tilting. And when the guns finally fell silent, the world would learn that a secret born from a single German mistake had guided the Allies through their darkest hours. Unseen, unspoken, but decisive. When the war's fury finally began to wane, and the thunder of guns gave way to uneasy silence, the truth of what had happened inside Bletchley Park remained hidden behind layers of secrecy. The world celebrated its victories on open battlefields, El Alamein, Stalingrad, Normandy. But few understood that many of those victories had already been decided in the quiet rooms of Buckinghamshire. Ultra had become the invisible thread woven through the fabric of Allied strategy. Its fingerprints touched every theater, every campaign, yet it was never allowed to be seen. The impact on the Battle of the Atlantic alone was immeasurable. Before Bletchley's breakthroughs, Britain was losing ships faster than it could replace them. In 1941, more than 6 million tons of merchant shipping had been sunk by German U-boats. But once ultra-intelligence reached full operational strength in 1943, those numbers fell sharply. Convoys began arriving safely, and for the first time in years, Britain's supply lines stabilized. The Navy could anticipate enemy movements, redirecting routes with surgical precision. Each decrypted message meant lives saved, not in the hundreds, but in the tens of thousands. Behind the statistics lay the invisible rhythm of the codebreakers' work. Long nights, cold fingers, and minds that refused to yield. The effect rippled across continents. In North Africa, Ultra provided intelligence that allowed the Allies to cripple Rommel's supply chain, paving the way for Montgomery's victory at El Alamein. In the Mediterranean, it guided operations in Sicily and Italy, allowing Allied forces to predict German reinforcements and airstrikes. Even in the vast Eastern Front, where the Soviets bore the heaviest burden, intercepted communications shared discreetly through diplomatic channels helped Stalin's commanders prepare for German offensives. The war had turned into a chess match, and the Allies, for once, could see the board clearly. Yet for all its triumphs, Ultra remained a secret burden. The codebreakers could not speak of their work, even as they watched newspapers credit generals and admirals for victories they knew had been shaped by invisible hands. There were no medals, no parades, no mentions in dispatches. Their silence was their service. The secrecy extended so deep that even among themselves, knowledge was compartmentalized. A linguist in Hut 3 might never learn what the engineers in Hut 11 were doing. Each knew only their fragment of the whole, a design meant to protect the secret from exposure. but one that also isolated those who carried it. Wartime discipline demanded more than intellect. It demanded restraint. There were moments when Ultra revealed disasters in motion, convoys steaming toward ambush, raids planned on unsuspecting towns, yet to intervene too precisely risked revealing the source. The commanders who received Ultra reports often had to choose between lives and secrecy. Some ships were left to sail into danger so that the greater secret could survive. These decisions, made quietly and without recognition, weighed heavily on those who understood their consequences. Victory, they realized, was built not only on action, but on calculated silence. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Bletchley Park began to empty. The huts, once filled with cigarette smoke and the sound of typewriters, grew quiet. Machines were dismantled, papers burned, and memories locked behind the Official Secrets Act. Those who had labored there were instructed never to speak of what they had done, not to family, not to friends, not even to each other. The war had ended, but the silence continued. Still, the legacy of Ultra endured. Its lessons reshaped intelligence forever. The importance of information, the power of intercepts, and the necessity of secrecy became the foundation of modern cryptography and espionage. The men and women who had worked in anonymity had changed warfare itself, though the world would not know it for decades. And as the peace settled uneasily over Europe, Bletchley's secret remained buried, a silent monument to the war's most extraordinary mind battle, whose victory could never be celebrated in public. When peace finally blanketed Europe, Bletchley Park ceased to hum. The once bustling huts fell silent, the clatter of typewriters replaced by birdsong and wind through cracked windows. The great engines of decryption were dismantled, and their remains hidden or destroyed. The war was over, but the secret that had helped win it was to be buried deeper than any bomb ever dropped. Under the Official Secrets Act, those who had worked at Bletchley were forbidden to speak of their service. For decades, even husbands and wives who had sat side by side through endless nights never revealed the truth of what they had done. Their silence became a living monument to duty. The intelligence itself, however, did not die. Ultra became the model for a new kind of warfare, one fought through information, interception, and analysis. The cryptographic techniques born at Bletchley evolved into the architecture of post-war intelligence agencies. When the Cold War began, Britain and the United States built vast networks of listening posts, satellites, and code-breaking units that traced their lineage directly to the huts of Buckinghamshire. The lessons learned from Enigma shaped everything that followed, from the founding of GCHQ in Britain to the establishment of the NSA in America. Bletchley Park was no longer a place. It had become an idea that knowledge, when protected and used wisely, could outweigh armies. For Germany, the reckoning came slowly. After the war, captured officers and technicians were confronted with evidence that their treasured Enigma had been compromised for years. Many refused to believe it. The machine they had trusted, the fortress of their communication, had been their undoing. Historians later uncovered German memos warning of procedural sloppiness, of repeated keys and careless operators, but those warnings had been dismissed during the war. Overconfidence had blinded them. They had built perfection in hardware, but ignored imperfection in men. In that contradiction lay their downfall. The statistical measure of Ultra's impact remains staggering. Modern historians estimate that it shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years and saved millions of lives. Every intercepted order that rerouted a convoy or foiled an ambush became a thread in a vast tapestry of victory. It was not the kind of triumph sung about in the streets or captured in photographs. It was the quiet kind, one built on calculation, discipline, and moral endurance. The victory of the mind over the machine. For those who served at Bletchley, the years after the war were strange and hollow. Many returned to universities, classrooms, or ordinary jobs, carrying memories they could never share. Alan Turing, whose intellect had helped crack the Enigma and design the bombs, returned to research in computer science, a field his wartime work had made possible. Yet his brilliance went unrecognized during his lifetime. Persecuted under Britain's laws for his personal life and stripped of his security clearances, He died in 1954, never knowing that his contribution would one day be celebrated as one of humanity's greatest achievements. His story, like Bletchley's, remained locked in silence. The veil did not lift until the 1970s, when declassification finally revealed the full scale of the operation. The world learned, almost in disbelief, that a small group of mathematicians and linguists had quietly shaped the outcome of the most destructive war in history. The story of Ultra, once hidden behind secrecy, became a legend, not of weapons or heroism, but of intellect and persistence. The revelation rewrote the history of World War II, showing that victory was not only forged in the skies and seas, but also in the coded shadows where logic battled arrogance. By then, most of the original codebreakers had grown old. Many spoke for the first time about their experiences, softly, modestly, without grandeur. They had done their duty, they said, nothing more. Yet their quiet labor had changed the world. The secret that began with a single German mistake had rippled through history, proving that even in the darkest years of war, knowledge, calm, patient, and precise, could stand against chaos itself. History often remembers the thunder, the battles, the bombs, the marches through ruined cities. But the story of Bletchley Park and the breaking of Enigma reminds us that some of humanity's greatest victories are won in silence. There were no front lines here, no medals pinned to uniforms under sunlight. There were only minds, disciplined, exhausted, quietly defiant, working through cold nights to find patterns in chaos. Their weapon was logic, their courage was patience, and their battleground was a page filled with nonsense that only they believed could make sense. The German mistake that began it all was almost laughably small, a repeated sequence, a lapse in discipline, a gesture of human habit. Yet from that single crack, an entire empire of secrecy unraveled. It is one of the enduring paradoxes of war, that the fate of millions can hinge not on the might of nations, but on the carelessness of one man at a radio desk. Enigma's downfall was not mechanical, it was human, and in that truth lies a timeless lesson, that perfection in war is an illusion, because war itself is built by imperfect hands. Ultra proved something deeper than strategic brilliance. It showed that information, when wielded with restraint and intelligence, could save more lives than any weapon ever forged. The men and women of Bletchley Park did not fight to destroy. They fought to understand, to reveal the unseen patterns that govern conflict. In doing so, they redefined what it meant to wage war. Long after the last code was cracked and the huts were emptied, their work continued to echo. Every computer, every intelligence agency, every algorithm that protects or deciphers owes its lineage to that quiet estate in Buckinghamshire. Bletchley Park was not merely a place on a map, it was the moment humanity proved that intellect could triumph over fear, and that the smallest human error could become the key to ending the greatest human tragedy. From a single mistake, they built a miracle of reason, and in that miracle, they changed the course of history forever.